You begin with the ordinary assumption that pain is something to be avoided. You regard it as a sign of failure, interruption, or misalignment. When discomfort appears, your instinct is to escape it, suppress it, or search for explanations that will neutralize it. Yet if you examine your experience more closely, you notice something unexpected. Pain often reveals what comfort hides. Al-Ghazali confronted this during his own inner crisis. He realized that certain forms of pain are not defects in understanding but signals that understanding has been incomplete. Instead of treating pain as an enemy, he treated it as information. You begin to ask, what if pain exposes what the mind has been unwilling to see? Al-Ghazali lived in an environment where intellectual excellence was prized. Baghdad scholars competed through argument, precision, and mastery of doctrine. Pain was interpreted as weakness. Doubt was interpreted as instability. Emotional disturbance was considered a failure of discipline. Yet Al-Ghazali saw that many confident scholars were internally unsettled. Their intellectual strength concealed psychological fragility. Pain was not absent, it was ignored. This environment shaped Al-Ghazali's realization. Internal disturbance is not an interruption of knowledge but part of the path to honest understanding. Al-Ghazali eventually recognized that the pain he experienced, the confusion, the uncertainty, the inner conflict, was not merely emotional turbulence. It was diagnostic. It revealed the gap between his beliefs and reality. You begin to see the same pattern. When a belief collapses, the pain that follows exposes where certainty was built on assumption. When you act against your deeper understanding, the discomfort indicates misalignment. Pain becomes a form of inner feedback, not punishment. It interrupts habitual thinking and forces you to question what you previously accepted. Al-Ghazali realized that pain does not break understanding, it prepares it. You often treat pain as a malfunction, assuming it arises only when something is wrong with you. Yet when you examine it more carefully, you notice that certain forms of discomfort emerge precisely when something within you is becoming clearer. Pain appears when a false belief is challenged. It appears when an assumption dissolves. It appears when a pattern of thought becomes unsustainable. Al-Ghazali understood that the mind fears pain because it threatens its stability. But this fear is based on misinterpretation. Pain feels destabilizing because it disrupts illusions, not because it disrupts truth. Pain forces the mind to confront what it has avoided. It removes the possibility of continuing with unexamined certainty. You begin to see that pain is not inherently negative. It becomes negative only when you assume its presence means something is wrong. But Al-Ghazali saw that pain often means something is becoming right. It is the mind's recognition that false confidence is dissolving. This leads to the central question: is pain a sign of failure or the beginning of alignment? Pain has a revealing structure. When it arises, it points to something specific. If you listen carefully, you can identify what belief or assumption it exposes. For Al-Ghazali, pain became a mirror that reflected the difference between what he claimed to know and what he truly understood. You notice the same dynamic in yourself. Pain does not appear randomly. It appears when there is friction between your inner reality and your conceptual framework. It appears when you force yourself to maintain beliefs that no longer resonate. It appears when you cling to conclusions that have lost their grounding. Al-Ghazali used pain to examine himself. He asked, "What is this discomfort showing me? What belief is collapsing? What expectation is failing?" Pain became a signal pointing toward areas where he had been deceiving himself. Instead of resisting pain, he used it. You begin to see that pain does not distort your perception, it removes distortion. It does not weaken clarity, it reveals where clarity was missing. Pain does not break truth, it breaks illusion. And so another question emerges: What becomes possible when you stop resisting the discomfort that illuminates your blind spots? When you allow pain to be examined rather than avoided, you notice something subtle. Pain focuses attention. It sharpens awareness. It prevents you from continuing in the same pattern without reflection. Pain interrupts you precisely where habit would otherwise continue blindly. Al-Ghazali recognized that this sharpening effect was necessary. Without pain, the mind remains comfortable within its assumptions. Comfort rarely leads to examination. Pain does. Pain forces a reevaluation of thoughts you assumed were true. It reveals contradictions, inconsistencies, and misunderstandings. As you observe pain with clarity, it becomes less chaotic. You start to see patterns. Certain beliefs always produce tension. Certain actions always produce regret. Certain perceptions always produce resistance. Pain clarifies these patterns without judgment. Pain becomes a refining process. It removes what is false by exposing its consequences. Once falsehood is seen, it loses its power. This is not emotional healing. It is cognitive alignment. The mind adjusts because it cannot sustain beliefs that continually produce conflict. And now you notice a transformation. Pain that is acknowledged becomes less painful. Pain that is resisted becomes more painful. Most suffering arises not from pain itself but from the narrative you attach to it. When discomfort arises, you create explanations, predictions, fears, and interpretations. These mental stories prolong the pain and distort its meaning. Al-Ghazali observed that when pain is experienced without narrative, it becomes simple. It is a signal, not a crisis. It reveals an inner truth, not a personal failure. When you stop adding assumptions to discomfort, the discomfort becomes manageable. It may be intense, but it is clear. You begin to practice this recognition. When pain arises, you observe it without creating conclusions. You do not decide that it means something terrible. You do not interpret it as permanence. You simply see the fact of pain. Without the story, pain reveals itself as an interruption meant to redirect your attention. It does not create identity. It does not define your value. It does not predict your future. It only shows what has been hidden. This shift is what Al-Ghazali meant when he said that pain becomes purification. The purification does not reduce sensation, it removes distortion. Pain becomes a form of inner honesty. And from this honesty, another realization emerges. Pain is bearable when it is not turned into meaning. As pain is examined directly, something important becomes visible. Pain reveals truths that comfort conceals. When you experience discomfort, you are forced to confront areas where you are out of alignment with your deeper understanding. Al-Ghazali discovered that moments of inner disturbance were often moments when truth was pressing against the boundary of his assumptions. Pain was not an obstacle, it was a pointer. It showed him where he had been mistaken, where he had been rigid, or where he had been afraid to acknowledge something essential. You begin to sense this in your own experience. Pain arises when the mind is holding on to something that no longer fits. Pain appears when truth is closer than the mind is prepared to accept. Pain indicates that understanding is in transition. If you respond to pain with avoidance, the transition halts. If you respond with examination, the transition completes. Pain becomes a catalyst for clarity. This recognition weakens your resistance. Instead of fearing pain, you see its purpose. You do not seek it, but you do not run from it. You understand that pain, when met with awareness, becomes the beginning of insight. And so you finally see Al-Ghazali's realization. Pain does not obstruct truth, it prepares the heart to receive it. Once pain has been understood as information rather than threat, a noticeable shift occurs. You begin to see with greater accuracy. You notice patterns that were previously invisible. You understand motivations that were hidden. You recognize illusions that you once defended. Al-Ghazali described this stage as the restoration of vision. When pain dissolves confusion, perception becomes precise. You are no longer interpreting reality through the filters of fear or desire. You are observing it directly. Clear vision does not produce comfort immediately. It produces honesty. It brings understanding of what must change, what must dissolve, and what must be accepted. Pain removes distortion. Clarity emerges naturally. You begin to trust this clarity not because it feels good but because it feels true. It does not require reassurance. It does not require validation. It stands on its own. You realize that the clarity that follows pain is different from ordinary insight. It is grounded, stable, and quiet. It does not fluctuate with emotion. It does not depend on external conditions. It arises from the removal of internal interference. This clarity is the vision Al-Ghazali believed pain was meant to restore, the ability to see without distortion. There comes a point when the function of pain is complete. Once the belief that caused the pain dissolves, the pain loses its foundation. Pain does not need to be pushed away. It ends when its message is understood. Al-Ghazali explained that pain persists only as long as misunderstanding persists. When clarity emerges, pain has no further role. It appears, does its work, and disappears. It is a temporary companion of transformation, not a permanent condition. You begin to notice this directly. As soon as you accept a truth you were resisting, the tension dissolves. As soon as you release a belief that conflicted with your deeper understanding, the discomfort evaporates. Pain ends not through control, but through insight. This does not make you indifferent to pain. It makes you wiser in your response. You do not see pain as failure but as instruction. You recognize that the end of pain is not forced, it is understood. And in this moment of understanding, you notice that the mind becomes quiet. Pain no longer occupies attention. Clarity remains. You realize that pain is not an enemy of peace. It is the process through which peace becomes possible. As your inquiry settles, you sense a quietness that does not depend on pleasure or comfort. Pain has done its work. It has revealed what was hidden, exposed what was false, and dissolved what was rigid. What remains is not relief but understanding. Al-Ghazali saw that the restoration of vision occurs when the mind stops resisting reality. Pain was not the obstacle, resistance was. When resistance dissolves, the mind rests naturally. The stillness that follows is not created by achievement. It is the absence of conflict. It is the clarity that remains when distortion ends. And in this stillness, vision becomes effortless.